Hi everyone, in this video I will be reviewing Matthew Desmond and Mustafa Emmerbayer's article, What is Racial Domination? The article explains how race is socially created and how racism operates through systems and institutions, and how racial domination affects everyday life. I'll first explain the major concepts from the article, and then I'll analyze media coverage in women's tennis as my outside media that I'm connecting it to using those ideas. To start off, I'm going to discuss the major elements of Desmond and Emmerbayer's definition of race. There was the four main categories. These elements were symbolic category, the phenotype or ancestry, the social and historical construction, and then the misrecognized as natural section. They defined race as a symbolic category based on phenotype or ancestry and constructed according to specific social and historical context that is misrecognized as a natural category. These elements help explain that race is not biological or fixed. Instead, race is created and maintained through society, history, and power. I've never heard of it discussed this way, so I thought this concept was really interesting. And then to define each of the elements in my own words, I view the symbolic category as meaning that race is based on meanings people create in society. Humans will decide which physical traits matter and then attach labels and stereotypes to those traits. Race only exists because people socially recognized and reinforced these categories, according to this article. For example, society groups people into categories like Black, white, Asian, or Hispanic, even though there is a more genetic variation within racial groups than between them. And I think there's just a much more generic way I'd be describing people. Like, it really could just be a little more simple. And then the phenotype or ancestry. The phenotype describes the physical characteristics of someone, like their skin color, hair texture, or facial features are kind of the biggest ones that get pulled into the race discussion. Ancestry refers to the family lineage or heritage, so kind of where they're from. And then these authors explain that racial classification can depend on either one. Sometimes society classifies people mainly by appearance, while sometimes ancestry becomes more important. Like, if you don't look a way that people don't, if people don't think you look the way you look, they're gonna need evidence, kind of. It's kind of a dumb concept, but I've seen it happen a lot. This shows that race is inconsistent and definitely socially determined instead of scientifically fixed in some situations. The social and historical construction. Race changes depending on time period and location. Different societies create different racial categories based on political, economic, and historical conditions. For example, racial categories in the United States are not identical to racial categories in other countries. The meaning of race has also changed throughout American history. This supports their theory that race is socially constructed rather than permanent or universal. And then the last element was that it's misrecognized as natural. The authors explain that people often treat race as though it is a natural or biological trait, even though it was more so society created. This process is called naturalization, as they explained. And because people see race as real and natural, racial inequality can appear normal or inevitable. Instead of recognizing racism as socially produced, people may falsely believe inequality exists because of biological differences. I'd say there's a lot more that goes to it than this. I can definitely view how the authors are putting it out there in this way, though. Um, I'm going to talk about the ethnicity and nationality compared to race. Um, these authors compared and distinguishes race from ethnicity and nationality very distinctly. Ethnicity refers to shared cultural traditions, the language, the religion, the customs, and heritage. Ethnicity focuses more on culture and identity than physical appearance. For example, someone may identify ethnically as Irish, Mexican, or Somali. Um, like I've done my ancestry and I know like what my ethnicity is. And then the nationality refers to legal citizenship or memberships in a nation state. It is tied to political belonging. For example, someone may have American nationality regardless of race or ethnicity. The difference from race is that race is mainly about socially constructed categories connected to physical appearance, obviously, and ancestry. Ethnicity focuses on culture, while nationality focuses on citizenship and political identity. And then the authors also explain that these categories overlap and influence one another, but they are not the same thing. They began to talk about racial domination. They describe racial domination as a system where one racial group maintains power and advantage over another. They explain that racial domination appears in two main ways. There's the institutional racism and the interpersonal racism. The institutional racism exists within social institutions like schools, housing, healthcare, uh, policing, businesses, and politics. These systems distribute opportunities and resources unequally. The authors argue that institutional racism benefits white people collectively, even if individuals do not consciously intend harm. Some examples of these include unequal school funding, housing discrimination, employment inequality, and then the differences in healthcare access. Institutional racism is powerful because it becomes built into moral society systems. However, I think this has changed so much nowadays, like with social media and everyone being able to put out their opinions so much. I don't think this is necessarily as accurate anymore. Sure, there's some situations, but there's also some situations with the opposite. So I don't feel like racism is as prevalent now as it was. I think it's kind of becoming reverse. But there is interpersonal racism as well. This occurs in everyday interactions between people. This includes the stereotypes, prejudices, discriminatory behavior, insults, avoidance, or biased assumptions. The article explains that interpersonal racism is often subtle and normalized instead of openly hostile. It can appear in jokes, fears, assumptions, or daily habits. The authors emphasize that interpersonal racism is connected to institutional racism because social institutes shape how people think and behave. And then we'll discuss the symbolic violence and its relationship to racism. Symbolic violence happens when oppressed groups unknowingly accept these harmful beliefs about themselves that were created by dominant groups. These authors connect this idea to internalized racism. People may begin believing negative stereotypes about their own racial group because those messages are constantly reinforced through society and media. Again, I don't think this is prevalent now, but the article gives beauty standards as an example. The European features like lighter skin, straight hair, and blue eyes have historically been treated as the ideal standard of beauty, and like being super skinny. Because of this, some people internalize the idea that their natural features are less attractive or valuable. Like even me having brown hair, brown eyes, like I viewed that as not as great before, but it's like, it's whatever, you know? Um, Symbolic violence is powerful because it does not require physical force. Instead, the domination continues psychologically and culturally when unequal ideas have become normalized. Um, and then the last thing they talked about was the intersecting modes of domination. They explained that racial domination does not exist separately from other forms of oppression. Instead, race intersects with class, gender, sexuality, religion, disability, and nationality. The idea is connected to the intersectionality. For example, a wealthy Black person might still experience racism despite economic success. A poor white person may experience class disadvantages but still benefit from that racial privilege. And then a Black woman can experience both sexism and racism simultaneously. The authors argue that people's experiences cannot be understood through only one identity category. Like, that would be too difficult. There's obviously multiple systems of power that interact together. And then for the second section of this assignment, I'm going to be doing my media analysis, and I'm going to analyze media coverage of women tennis, specifically athletes like Serena Williams, which basically everyone knows, and Coco Gauff. She's probably one of my favorite tennis players right now. She plays for the US. I chose this because tennis is something I personally know and spend time around, and I think sports media reflects many of the concepts that the authors discuss in their article, What is Racial Domination? One major concept visible in women's tennis media is the intersectionality, or what the article calls intersecting modes of domination. Black female athletes often experience both racism and sexism at the same time. The media discussions are not only about athletic ability, but also they discuss appearance, attitude, femininity, and behavior, and the opportunity they have. This is common with all female tennis coverage, though. It doesn't necessarily pick apart the race. The biggest thing about this is that they're female. But these two have this slight racial aspect as well. For example, Serena Williams has been frequently described as aggressive or intimidating in situations where white athletes showing similar emotions were described as passionate or competitive. This happens in a lot of finals when they're acting the same way, but one's white, one's Black, and so they get described differently occasionally, and sometimes it can be good for the Black, sometimes it's not. But this reflects that the interpersonal racism, because this like stereotype influences how audiences and commenters interpret behavior. The article also discusses that symbolic violence, and this is when society normalizes certain standards and pressures, and then the people begin to accept them. In women's sports, there are strong beauty standards involving hair, body type, clothing, and femininity. Like, they are all addressed, and their hair is done in a certain way, they carry themselves in a certain way. All athletes, it doesn't necessarily get divided by race, but there is the culture that expects them to have their hair done a certain way, but that's Blacks within their own community type of thing, not the other way around. Athletes who do not fit these traditional expectations are often criticized more harshly. The institutional racism can also appear in sports media coverage. Excuse me. Certain athletes receive more positive promotion, sponsorship opportunities, or public sympathy than others. This is a huge one because tennis, you get paid from being pro and in these things, but if you're not top 10 or top 20, you're not making a livable wage. So you need these sponsorships. Even when the opportunities appear equal on the surface, media systems can still reinforce racial stereotypes and unequal treatment. Or there'll be companies that specifically have products that they want a Black person to promote because it goes along with the upkeeping of their appearance versus there's just a lot of ones that stick with white people, which is strange, but just that historical prevalence. The authors of this article argue that the radical domination, oh, no, sorry, not radical, the racial domination is often subtle and built into everyday systems and interactions. Sports media is a good example because these patterns are often normalized and repeated so frequently that people stop noticing them. It just becomes the norm when you're watching. And then at the same time, athletes like Coco Gauff have helped challenge these stereotypes and create more representation within tennis. This shows that racial meanings and systems can change over time because race itself is socially constructed. Coco Gauff is one of the most liked athletes, like female tennis players right now, because she has good sportsmanship. She is very respectable. She stays on the surface, but I think she does all that because she didn't want to be viewed negatively. Like, I don't know if she would have let her emotions show more right off the bat, but she shows her emotion more now than she used to. And obviously, Serena Williams built up her own title, and she gets respected just from how good she's at tennis long term. But in conclusion, Desmond and Emmer Bayer argue that race is socially created and constructed rather than biologically natural. They explain how racial domination often operates through institutions, interpersonal interactions, symbolic violence, and intersecting systems of power. Their article encourages people to think beyond individual prejudice and recognize how racism becomes embedded within society itself. By applying these ideas to women's tennis media coverage, we can better understand how racial domination continues to shape culture, continues to shape culture, representation, and social interactions today.